Okay, let's move on to Assembly Member Hall.
Okay, thank you. Morning, Mr. Mayor. I'm discussing the protests. So on the holiest day in the Jewish calendar and on the day of the horrific terror attack in Manchester, pro-Palestinian protesters gathered along Whitehall and the Cenotaph to chant offensive slogans and clap to them, play loud music and wave offensive signs. Protesters gathered at Liverpool Street Station, screaming chants at passing commuters. Protesters could be heard chanting "from the river to the sea" and describing Israel as a terror state. So on the day of the
Assemblymember Hall begins by framing her questions around the context of recent protests that took place on one of the holiest days in the Jewish calendar, coinciding with the tragic terror attack in Manchester. She outlined specific actions by pro-Palestinian protesters, including chanting offensive slogans, playing loud music, and waving provocative signs. She describes the location of these events, Whitehall, the Senate, and Liverpool Street Station, and highlights the impact on commuters and members of the public. The purpose of this framing is to focus the discussion on public safety, sensitivity, and emotional impact on affected communities rather than partisan politics.
Manchester terror attack, was that behaviour appropriate?
No, I don't think it was. I think it's important to distinguish between what's lawful and what's considerate, mindful, and sensitive. And it's worth just spending time talking to Jewish people. You know, there is one state that has a Jewish majority, and many people have an affinity to that who are of the Jewish faith. And on the day when a place of worship, on the Day of Atonement, has been attacked by a terrorist, you can understand, I hope, why Jewish people are feeling frightened. And let's not go to what the law is. I think you use the word appropriate. That's a good word. I don't think it's appropriate because people are feeling scared and frightened more so.
They are.
More so.
The Assembly member directly asked the mayor whether the behavior observed during these protests was appropriate, particularly given the context of the terror attack and the religious significance of the day. She emphasizes that the protests caused fear and distress within the Jewish community. The mayor responds by distinguishing between legality and sensitivity, acknowledging that while certain acts may be lawful, they may not be considered or mindful of the emotional impact on affected communities. He stresses the importance of understanding perspectives of Jewish people and their historical and cultural affiliations with Israel.
In the recent past.
Okay, so do you think that the behaviour of the protesters in Whitehall and at Liverpool Street is anti-Semitic?
Well, you're asking a general question about individuals' behaviour. I think it's insensitive, and I think it's...
No, is it anti-Semitic?
No, I don't think marching's anti-Semitic.
So you don't think screaming "from the river to the sea and calling it a terror state is anti-Semitic?
Okay. So the members now extended a question from "is the march anti-Semitic" to now specific phrases of anti-Semitic.
Well, the phrase is constantly being used during these hate marches. This is why I'm asking the question. Do you think to scream "from the river to the sea," which they're doing during these hate marches, is appropriate? Do you think it is anti-Semitic?
Continuing, the Assembly member presses the mayor on whether he believes the behavior exhibited was anti-Semitic. The mayor responds cautiously, suggesting that context matters when determining intent or classification. He emphasizes that fear and sensitivity are real concerns, particularly on a day marked by violence and tragedy. This clip highlights the tension between legal frameworks for protest and the lived experiences of communities who may feel threatened or targeted by particular chants or slogans.
Okay, I don't think it's anti-Semitic, and I think it's all about context. And we had the same conversation, by the way, Chair, a month ago when the member was arguing that the far right should be allowed to march, and we were having this conversation about Article 10 and freedom of expression. Now, I already said I think it's inappropriate and insensitive on the day of a terrorist attack to have these sorts of marches. Some slogans can be anti-Semitic, but it's all about context. And in certain contexts, yes, those slogans are anti-Semitic. In other contexts, they're not.
Well, we will differ on that view. All we ever hear is "from the river to the sea," and we all know what that means, and that is anti-Semitic. You released a statement the day after the protests, and at no point did you criticise the appalling behaviour.
The Assembly member asks pointedly whether the commonly chanted phrase, "from the river to the sea," should be considered anti-Semitic. She notes that it is repeatedly used in these protests and contributes to a climate of fear. The mayor clarifies that while some phrases can be anti-Semitic in certain contexts, their classification depends on intent and setting. He reiterates that inappropriate or insensitive behavior is distinct from legally punishable hate speech, and that context shapes interpretation.
You were unequivocal when you were talking about one particular protest last month, claiming that that was far right. Well, so why don't you describe these protests as clearly? Because they're not only plainly wrong, they are anti-Semitic.
Look, the difference, I would say, respectfully, between the member and myself is I'm consistent. So the member argues for the right of the far right to protest, but criticises pro-Palestinians.
They're not far right. They wave flags like this. That does not make me far right. That makes me very patriotic, actually. So you immediately come down on those, and yet we have had these anti-Semitic comments constantly from these hate.
The mayor expands on the principle of freedom of expression and the right to protest, referencing previous discussions about far-right marches. He highlights the challenge of balancing democratic freedoms with the emotional and psychological impact on communities. This clip emphasizes complexity of governance, where public officials must protect both civil liberties and vulnerable populations, while navigating subjective perceptions of harm or offense.
Marches, and you don't comment on that at all. Last month you said politicians have refused to condemn the rising tide of hatred in this country. So you should be happy to condemn the behaviour we saw at these pro-Palestinian protests.
Well, again, we're going to disagree here because I think Stephen Jackson Lennon is a racist. He's a violent racist, and when he organises a march, it's a far-right march.
Isn't it interesting? That is racist. To call people, to say that from the river to the sea isn't, of course, no, because perhaps that's coming from a side that should be allowed to say that. To say terror state, perhaps that's allowed as well. It's amazing, isn't it? And yet merely flying a flag immediately, it's...
The assembly member critiques the mayor for perceived inconsistencies in his response to protests, noting that he was unequivocal in condemning far-right events. Yet she feels he's been less clear on pro-Palestinian demonstrations. She argues that such inconsistencies can undermine trust in leadership and exacerbate fear in affected communities. The mayor responds by asserting that he is consistent in defending the right to protest regardless of political alignment, distinguishing between violent racism and lawful expression.
Right. I mean, do you actually understand why the Jewish community feels unable to do, as you say, live, work and worship freely without fear of harassment, discrimination, intimidation or violence when they see the duplicity of your remarks when discussing protests on different sides? Do you not understand why they are so concerned about this?
Actually, I've never mentioned flags. I know she's obsessed by flags. I've never mentioned flags. I'm quite clear in relation to what rights were allowed in terms of freedom of expression, freedom of...
The assembly member raises the tangible consequences of these protests on the Jewish community, describing how fear has led some to restrict their children's movements, limit school attendance, or avoid entering London. She frames this as an urgent public safety concern, arguing that leadership requires proactive reassurance and tangible action to protect vulnerable populations. The mayor responds by outlining prior efforts to reassure the Jewish community and reiterates the importance of supporting lawful protest while addressing fear.
Speech, the right to protest, the cornerstone of our democracy. Even when you disagree with what people are protesting about, I will fight to the death the right to protest and the right to march and so forth. Even the right of Stephen Jackson Lennon, a racist, to march. He's allowed to do so.
Mr. Mayor, look, you are the mayor of this wonderful city. Does it not worry you that there is one community that has to lock its children in schools for their safety? There is one community that...
The mayor discusses the difference between what is legally permissible and what is considered sensitive or appropriate. He explains that not all offensive speech qualifies as hate speech, but that officials must be aware of context, intent, and emotional impact on specific communities. This clip underscores the nuanced legal and ethical considerations city leadership must weigh when responding to public demonstrations and protests.
Can't come into London because of their listening to chants like "From the River to the Sea," where they're looking at Palestinian flags and hostility towards them. Do you not see that in London, to have one community that is so badly disadvantaged by what is going on with these anti-Semitic chants, that you, as mayor of this great city, should do something about that?
Which I couldn't be clear in my remarks in relation to my concern about the fear, the increased fear Jewish Londoners and Jewish people across the globe are feeling after the events of last.
Throughout the exchange, the Assembly member expresses frustration at perceived inaction and the continued distress of the Jewish community. She emphasizes that public officials have a moral and civic duty to acknowledge and respond to fear and intimidation. This clip highlights the emotional intensity of public accountability debates, illustrating the intersection of politics, public perception, and the responsibilities of elected officials.
Thursday, I've gone out of my way since October the 7th, 2023, to reassure Jewish Londoners and Jewish people across the country and across the...
But they don't feel reassured. How can they feel reassured?
Member,
but
there's a number of interruptions now that you're making. I understand the point you tried to get across.
Mainly because he's not listening, Chair. He's not listening and he's not understanding.
But you can't keep interrupting. You have to allow him to answer in the way that he does, and then you can come back again. No one will object to that.
I tell you what, I'll finish here because you will not do anything about this, and shame on you, because our Jewish community need looking after, and as Mayor of London, you are not doing that. And my time is up, Chairman. Thank you.
The exchange concludes with the Assembly member calling the mayor to take visible action to reassure the Jewish community, emphasizing that words alone are insufficient to address fear and distress. The mayor reiterates his prior efforts to provide reassurance and to distinguish lawful protest from hateful behavior, while acknowledging the challenge of balancing rights, freedoms, and public safety. The final clip encapsulates the ongoing tension between protecting democratic rights, ensuring community safety, and maintaining public trust in governance.